Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's workshop. I'm Christy Anderson. I teach at the University of Toronto, and I'm also the editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin. And while we, all of us, hope that you will see this workshop as a stimulus to sending in articles to the Art Bulletin and to the Art Journal and to other CAA publications. Really, the goal today is to help you with the whole publishing process, especially as it relates to crafting, submitting, revising articles. So in organizing these sessions, and this is the second of our two sessions this summer, following on from last week's really successful workshop on how to craft an essay, especially out of a large amount of material, such as a dissertation. In organizing these sessions, really our goal was to help demystify some elements of the writing and submission process. For many authors, the process of submitting that first big article comes at a very precarious time in your career. You may have recently finished a dissertation, you're starting a job, applying for jobs in the middle of a postdoc, and you tend to be a bit more adrift than you might have been when you were a PhD student. So our idea is to really help you kind of make that transition, and we hope it's useful for emerging scholars as well as for scholars who have been at this for some time. One of the things that I want to stress in these workshops and really to sort of get out there is that when you look at articles that have been published in the Art Bulletin or anywhere else, you see them as these sort of complete and perfect things, but that's not the way that they came in to my desk. Everyone's article gets revised. Nobody, even the old and famous, don't get articles in sort of with no revision. So we want to kind of talk about how revision is really an important part of this process, and part that very often you don't see when you just look at the articles. Before I introduce the panelists today, I do want to thank all of them in advance, and also especially to thank the staff at CAA, including Megan Donahue, Jevi Peters, and Eugenia Bell, who have really made this happen, have helped us with the technical aspects, and sort of done all the work behind the scenes. So today we have, in addition to me as moderator, we have three panelists, all of whom have published in the Art Bulletin. Let me introduce them, and then they're going to give a short presentation, and then we have lots of time for questions. And I will encourage you throughout this workshop, at any point you can type in questions into the chat, and we'll get to those after the presentations, but you can do it. If you have a question now that you want to ask, or you hear something that you want to know more about, please just type it in. So our three panelists, the first of whom is Jennifer Van Horn, who holds a joint appointment as Associate Professor in Art History and History at the University of Delaware. She is the author of The Power of Objects in 18th Century British America, which came out in 2017, and Portraits of Resistance, Activating Art During Slavery, which came out in 22. She's co-edited a special double issue of the Winter Portfolio entitled Enslavement and Its Legacies, and is now co-editing the collected volume, The Disabled Gaze, Multi-Sensory Perspectives of Art, Bodies, and Objects. She also serves as the president of the Historians of 18th Century Art and Architecture, in addition to being a member of the editorial board of the Art Bulletin. Maggie Chow is associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she is the David G. Frey Scholar of American Art. Her research focuses on the history of globalization, with particular interest in intersections of art with histories of technology, natural science, and economics in the 18th and 19th centuries. She is the author of The End of Landscape in 19th Century America, which examines the fate of the nation's preeminent artistic genre after the Civil War, and her forthcoming book, Painting U.S. Empire, 19th Century Art and Its Legacies, will be the first synthetic treatment of early U.S. imperialism in the global context. And this year she was a guest scholar at the Getty Research Institute. Maggie is also a member of the editorial board of Art Bulletin. Our third panelist is James Pilgrim, whose article in Art Bulletin came out in September 2023. He is an assistant professor of art history at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and he's a specialist in early modern European visual and material culture. He researches the ways in which artists of the period contributed to the emergence of a new environmental discourse and consciousness, a new global imaginary, and a growing skepticism about the reliability of the visual, themes that are as important today as they were in the 16th and 17th century. His book project entitled Pastoral's End, Art, Ecology, and Disaster in Renaissance Italy is under contract with University of Chicago Press. And this book will look at the position and the work of Jacopo Bassano within the context of aggressive agricultural expansion and dramatic environmental transformations. I believe that Jennifer is going to say a few words first, and we'll go through each of the speakers and then come back to questions. And please, again, feel free to put questions in at any moment. Jennifer.
All right, thank you so much. That was such a kind introduction, so thank you, and thanks too for the invitation to join you all today. I'm really excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say, as well as for our dialogue afterward. And I have some notes to keep me on time, I hope. So like many of you, I perhaps dislike reading readers' reports. I have that dread of opening the PDF and seeing what it says. And in that moment, it can feel like anything but a gift, particularly when comments are from the well-publicized reader too. But I do recognize that peer review is a gift, that other scholars are taking time to engage seriously and a sustained way with our scholarship, which is an incredible benefit. So I want to share some of my idiosyncratic responses to making readers' reports constructive and getting the most out of this process to help revise and resubmit successfully. So the first thing I wanted to highlight is that I find it really important to keep in mind what readers don't mention. In other words, anything that is not kind of explicitly called out oftentimes in the reader's report is in fact a kind of acceptance of the argument that was made. So at times I found it really dispiriting that these points of an argument that I had fought so hard to generate, to articulate, and to support, then the reader report said absolutely nothing about them. And that could feel like a kind of resounding silence. But I'm starting to work to see those things that are not questioned in a reader's report as a success, as proof that portions of the argument worked and were convincing. And so trying to recognize that the unstated is often positive makes a lot more of the reader's report feel positive. So just thinking about it in terms of, maybe 70% of what you submitted did work and therefore was not mentioned. And so attention is really being called to that 30% that needs to be revised and revisited and adjusted. A similar kind of negative example is thinking about the ways that readers' comments can help you to understand what you have no interest in the essay doing. So in other words, a reader can help you to understand what you're not attempting to do. And that can really be a way to help you set up better boundaries around your intervention. It could help you to realize that, in order to substantiate a specific claim, you would need to engage in a much different project. And so it's worthwhile to either maybe cut a specific claim or a line of argument, or to gesture to it to say it's important, but that's beyond the scope of what you're doing. So I think being explicit about what you're not doing makes the space and the time for you to dedicate to what your essay is accomplishing, and really helps you from a kind of overreach in your argument that might be something that the reader is responding to and identifying. I also have started to think about readers' reports as a way to, revisit and to explicitly articulate methodological or theoretical groundings. So within my own work, which is focused on the deep entanglements between enslaved people of African origin and descent in the United States, and then the form of the painted portrait, some of my initial readers' reports called for more evidence, greater amounts of evidence or the use of more traditional forms of evidence. And to be frank, that just wasn't possible, right? Given the conditions of extreme disparity in power that have shaped the visual and material archive, the evidence that some readers sought could not be produced to the extent that it could for art histories that have really focused on white elite cultural production. And that made me realize that I needed to build acknowledgement of racist and settler colonial archives and strategies of archival redress for approaching those into my argument at the ground level. So to make those theoretical or methodological approaches part of my claims from the beginning. And I think it's really important to articulate those for an audience who at that point was not accustomed to thinking beyond the standards of evidence for a Western European-based type of art history. And that's certainly something to talk to a journal editor about as you're going through this process and part of a larger, I think, restructuring and reapproaching of art history as it works to become more inclusive. But at the level of the individual author, I think that might mean taking the time to articulate and to redefine some basic traditional assumptions that a reader needs to kind of shed or get rid of in order to engage with your argument, and in order to really understand what it is that you as author have accomplished. And then my last kind of piece of advice in approaching these is in some ways is like pre-work. So even before you kind of submit the essay, I think that baking into your process really thoughtful, accountable, and good citational practice is something that is going to absolutely benefit you at the time of the reader engaging with your work and writing the report. So I think about this as maybe being a way to head off the kind of knee-jerk reader's report that's like, you didn't cite XYZ, and that is kind of the critique that they raise. There's obviously lots of really important moral reasons to work towards citational equity, and I'm thinking of Catherine McKittrick's work here in particular. But from a kind of more prosaic perspective, you don't know who your reader will be, but oftentimes it will be somebody who is the expert in the field and someone who has a great investment in the field itself. And so showing that you're intellectually in conversation with a group of scholars, I think that kind of generosity pays off. Sometimes I think of it as maybe being the ambassador or the narrator for your subfield. And I think that's particularly true for a journal like the Art Bulletin, where multiple subfields are coming together in the publication. So your essay might be one of only a handful from your area of expertise that is going to be published within a certain 10 or 15-year horizon. And so you as author, in some ways, are performing your subdiscipline's current thinking and current kind of evolution to a larger audience. That's true of the readers of the journal, but when you get to the peer review process, your experts in your subfield probably are going to be reviewing your work. And so I think they really do appreciate authors who present the kind of current state of the subfield, and authors who want to kind of reflect upon the larger stakes of where a larger group of scholars are in the moment, not just the individual author's claims. So those are the things that I've been thinking about recently in relation to readers' reports, which continue to come across my desk, both good and bad. So I think at this point, I look forward to passing things on, I believe, to Maggie.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Maggie, you're up next.
Hi, sure. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's great to share some tips on responding to readers' reports. I wanted to show you a slide to start us off. So hopefully that can get up on the screen for you. So I published an article in the Art Bulletin in 2021, and I am just pulled on the right snippets from the actual reader reports I received. These were, of course, the lines that jumped out at me when I first read my readers' reports. As you can see, I don't have to read them out loud, but as you can see, you know, my readers thought that the argument wasn't very strong, that it wasn't rigorous enough, that it needed to be better organized. And of course, this is when you first encounter readers' reports, these are the things that you feel like, oh my gosh, my article is horrible. But in fact, this article, as you can see, actually got published. So in my time, I wanted to offer 5 pieces of really practical advice, which I think will, might help those of you who are dealing with readers' reports deal with this kind of feedback. Okay, so we can take the slide down. So the first thing that I wanted to first tip, which is what I always do, is when I get my readers' reports, I always read them twice when I first get them, because the first time you read them, you're always going to see the most negative criticism. So I always read them again just for the positives, to see what the positives are. And in fact, something I do, which, because I'm a more visual person, is I actually highlight them in different colors. All the stuff that I need to change or the things that I need to correct, deal with, I highlight in one color, and all the positive feedback, what I did well, what worked, I highlight in another color. It helps me to see that, there's positives in this as well. There are things that were successful. All right, the second piece of advice is to take some time to process what you've read. Any manuscript you submit, you've worked on for a really long time. And if you're anything like me, I feel like when I've submitted a manuscript, it's like a really complicated puzzle. There's no way anything can be taken out, added, rearranged at all. It will all fall apart as soon as I do anything. And so sometimes it's helpful to just digest what you've read and just take a week or something to not deal with the article at all. To let the stuff that you've, like the negative and positives, percolate, so that you can be more flexible towards editing later. The third tip is that what I like to do is I like to turn my reader reports into a to-do list. And this has to partly because I've highlighted all the critical feedback. Then when I go to start revising, I can tackle them one at a time. And, some feedback, some criticism is easier to deal with than others, not necessarily quickly. There are sometimes you get, really specific things like change this word or something, but there's always things that are easier to manage. For instance, I got some feedback on my article that was like, you really need more context for this point that you made. And so I went back to the library, got some more books, read up, synthesized, added a few more sentences to a few sections. And I called that, okay, I feel like I dealt with that comment. And then I literally cross it out of my reader report to feel like, okay, I've done that. I can kind of like check off all of these things that I can do. Fourth piece of advice is, obviously you've heard this before and you'll hear this from my colleagues here today. You can't change everything and you shouldn't change everything. As with any piece of writing, you can't listen to all your critics, and the editors and the board do their best to assign your article to readers that are not going to be openly hostile towards your work. But even neutral or sympathetic readers are a different kind of writer than you. And therefore, they're always going to be saying that they would, essentially what they're saying is like, well, if I were writing this article, I would do it this way. And you don't, you will not agree. But it's important that when you do disagree, that you recognize that your reader that you got the review from represents a certain portion of the audience out there. And so there's always going to be someone who's going to respond in the same way as they did. So, for example, the article I wrote for the Art Bulletin really focused mainly on one artwork by one artist that was neither of which was very well known, even in my subfield. And so the reader reports, both of them, in fact, I think, said like, well, why don't you talk about more artists? Why don't you give more examples? And, I felt really strongly that giving a bunch of examples would water down the argument. And so I didn't. But I also knew that other people would think the same thing. And so when I did my revisions, I articulated the specific reasons for why this particular artist and this particular artwork should be seen as representative of a broader practice. And I articulated that not just in response to the reader's reports, but in the actual revision of the article, because I recognized that other people in reading it would also perhaps feel as my readers did. And fifth and last piece of advice is that you should work with the editor. When I started publishing, this was not something I recognized I could do. I thought like, okay, I have to like deal with these all by myself. And in fact, the editor is there to help make your article better. And so you can always consult them. So readers' reports sometimes disagree. They could have two different readers saying different things that you should revise. They aren't always prescriptive. Sometimes they're just critical and they don't really tell you like how to address this problem. They just say, here's the problem. And those are really key instances in which an editor can play a role in helping you navigate what to do. And so when I wrote my article, I initially didn't consult the editor, but I had a lot of concerns about a key term in my paper. And I thought, okay, I can sort of deal with it, but I'm not sure if I'm dealing with this adequately. And so actually after the revisions, I had a series of exchanges with the then editor, who really helped me to kind of hone my language and get that sort of framing of a certain key term really well situated in the piece. And it helps not just make the article better, but, as many of you out there likely will do when you publish an article, it will, maybe be part of a larger project. And that working with the editor in sort of refining and defining this key term really made the whole book project from which this article came much better. So I cannot recommend more that's a resource that you should take advantage of. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Maggie. James.
Thank you, Christy. I hope everybody can hear me. Good. And really thank you to Jennifer and Maggie. It's really reassuring to hear such amazing scholars be honest about how stressful peer review continues to be. And I guess it's probably worth saying my own perspective on this is from somebody who's in a more junior position in the field. What I'll say is based on a shorter experience with the process of peer review, but intense over the past few years. So I've been through it at Art Bulletin, Renaissance Quarterly, the Mitteilung des Kunsthistorisches Institut, and Grey Room in the past 3 years or so. And in each case, the process has been a bit different. So I'll try and speak sort of in general terms, but it seemed only fair to let you know that, and because, again, I think the point of my being junior is important here, maybe. So it seemed useful to let you know what my experience is based on. So I think we're all of us sort of focusing in part on the back and forth with peer reviewers. And one of the things that I find myself thinking about the most when we were preparing for this is what it's like to deal with criticisms that are based upon a fundamentally different view of the works in question, and maybe based on a view that you are really trying to challenge. And how do you do that? How do you respond to those criticisms when you are junior, when you're not tenured, when you're in a postdoc, something like that? So in these cases, and I've had one or two situations like this myself, I've found myself trying to figure out how to modify an argument to satisfy peer reviewers who are, one assumes, fundamentally just like much better credentialed than you are. This is something I'll come back to in a second, but this involves addressing criticisms in the text itself, but also framing those in an accompanying response that publishers, I think in every instance have, or most places, for me, in my experience anyway, have asked you to provide. sort of a cover letter or an explanation of how you're going about responding to these things. And these are tricky sort of situations. And my own general sense is that you should always be skeptical of any advice which suggests that there's a tried and true formula for navigating anything, especially peer review and publishing in general. There are a few things that I've found sort of maybe worth bearing in mind. Some of these concern tone, both with your article and with everything in your sort of your correspondence with editors and with anybody involved in the process. Some of these concern content. So very quickly, just a few points. Regarding tone, I think it's always super important to bear in mind the time and effort that every peer reviewer puts into doing this work. This is maybe especially important to bear in mind if you fundamentally disagree with the conclusions that somebody reaches. They are doing, participating in a service to the field. So it's best not to second guess anybody's motives. The second, concerns the second point, the sort of value of adopting an extremely grateful, honestly being grateful for the time and effort that they put in. And maybe on a more sort of strategic level, adopting a kind of killing them with kindness approach when you're responding to any sorts of criticisms and suggestions. And this ties in maybe with a kind of a more ancillary third suggestion, which you can take or leave, which is it's maybe not worth time trying to figure out who peer reviewers are. I've sometimes thought who was on the other end of a chain of emails, that comes to you in an anonymous font. And I've never really known. I've, over the past few years, grown less and less confident. So don't worry about my senses, that kind of thinking. It's a waste of time. Treat the arguments, the criticisms, the questions that have come in on the page as a valuable opportunity. So that sort of gets us to content, which is the second sort of cluster of issues I wanted to suggest. So here, let's sort of assume, as I said, has been the case with me in a couple of instances, that a peer reviewer expresses skepticism about your methodological approach, or frankly, your entire argument. And, this has happened to me, as I say, a number of times as a very junior scholar. First, critical peer reviews, including vociferously sharp critical peer reviews, present an opportunity for you to see how someone like in the real world might engage with your article. You're getting a preview of a potential response from a really informed reader, if and when your article is actually published. That is so valuable for you. It's such a good opportunity for you to sharpen things up. So you have an opportunity here really to head off criticism, to fortify your article against potential criticisms before your writing sees the light of day. And when you're, this is a moment when everybody is starting to write not for a committee of 5 or 6 people, a few friends, but for the field as a whole. So there's a real opportunity there. So that's the first point. The second, and maybe most importantly, if after thinking things over, I totally agree with Maggie about the value of taking time, letting things percolate, figuring out what you really think about responses. If after taking that time, if after discussing things with Christy or whichever editor, whatever journal you happen to be working with, perhaps also with a few readers who you really trust and who know your work, but maybe not dozens. If after all of that, you feel basically that you're right and the peer reviewer is wrong, this is super simplistic, but defend your argument. Find ways of improving it. Take the most useful bits of their criticism to strengthen your argument, but trust your ideas and trust your writing too. Trust the generosity of the criticisms you get, but also you can't change everything, and you shouldn't, because your ideas are going to be worth presenting in and of themselves. So go with your gut, I think, would be my final point. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's great advice. I want to remind people, if you have questions about the editing process or the peer review process or responding to peer reviews, please feel free to put them into the chat. I just, before we kind of have a more free-for-all discussion, I thought it might be useful for people to know from the editor's point of view how peer review works, like how I find peer reviews, what gets peer reviewed. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just say a little bit about that. So peer reviews for the Art Bulletin are, in fact, double blind peer reviews, which is what that means is that the author of the essay does not know the identity of the reader. I do my very best to not reveal anything, even going so far as to changing the font of the comments to make sure that if somebody uses a particular font, they won't give that away if I just cut and paste the peer review. So that kind of keeping it safe on that side, and also from the peer reviewer's side. I do not tell people, I do everything I can with the help of the editorial assistant to take out any identifying footnotes, acknowledgements, anything that would sort of give away the identity of the author. I cannot send out everything that I receive for peer review. For the Art Bulletin, given the number of articles we have in, I probably send out about 25 or 30%. Because why don't I send out more? I mean, it would be great if I could, because doing a peer review is so much work. The peer reviews, and again, they really vary, but it is not uncommon for the peer review to be 5 or 6 pages single-spaced with comments. And that obviously takes some very generous scholar a long time to do. So I have to protect my peer reviewers, especially in fields that are smaller fields. So I am very protective to send out a portion of the essays. So how do I find the peer reviewers? The first thing that I do is look at your footnotes. I mean, that is, I go through your footnotes with a very fine-tooth comb to see who you're referring to, who you're engaged in conversation with. And so that should also be a suggestion to you to, knowing, and I can tell you I'm not the only editor who does this, help your editor by including people in the footnotes, like show me who you're talking to, show me who the group of scholars is that you're engaging with. So I go through, first of all, the footnotes. Then, and you have to assume that most fields I am not an expert in outside of my own little world. So I might ask people I know, I might send them the abstract and say, people I know who are in the field, who would be a good reader for this. So sometimes I'm asking friends, I'm using things like Google Scholar. I'm looking back at previous articles that have appeared in the Art Bulletin, because one of the, I don't want to say payments, one of the things I ask when you get something published in the Art Bulletin is that you then sort of pay it back and serve as a peer reviewer for other people. So I may look at see who's published something recently in the Art Bulletin around that field. But it usually takes me, I would say several hours for every article to find a list of names. And I usually try to come up with many more than I think I'll need, because I usually get about less than a 50% yes response rate. So people are busy, they're having babies, have other commitments that they have to do. So I often have to ask, let's say 4 or 5 people before I'll get 2 to 3 yeses. If your essay is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, I try to get someone kind of in both fields so that I'm checking to see comments about both kind of methodologies or subject matters. I try to be very careful about conflict of interest. I mean, both my own conflict of interest, but also yours. So depending on, I look people up. Where did they go to grad school? What institution are they connected with? I make sure to not have overlaps of asking people from your same institution. I mean, that probably would result in a loss of anonymity, but I'm also trying to keep as much as I can at arm's length distance so that, and I would really reiterate, I cannot tell you how many times people have said to me, I know who read my article. And I'm like, you're wrong, actually. That person did not read your article. So it's really hard to know who is out there reading your things. Let me think what else I wanted to say about that. I usually ask for about a 4-week turnaround for people. Again, that often gets extended because things happen, people are late, and so on. So that's, and usually I always have it for the Art Bulletin. I am always looking for at least 2 peer reviewers, and ideally 3. I try to get 3, but sometimes I don't get 3. 2 is fine, usually. If I get peer reviews back where one article says this is the greatest thing since sliced bread and the other one says no, 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 I'll send it out to a third. If I feel like, the 2 opinions are so incredibly varied. If I read them and think, okay, there's definitely things can be fixed in the essay, they can be massaged. I definitely want to see a new version of this. I will go through, I combine the peer reviews into usually one document with reader number 1, reader number 2. And I will write a cover letter which highlights not only what I think are the most important critiques from the readers, but also my critiques, things that I thought either in the writing, I mean, I may not be an expert on the field, but certainly about the argument or the language or getting rid of jargon, whatever it is, or the use of images, whatever that is, I tried to sort of add that in. Can we see the slide that I have? I wanted to show people the set of questions that I send with your essay to the readers. And these are the questions that I ask. And I think this might be helpful. So I'm asking, and this really is just sort of asking in various ways about different aspects of the article. Is the topic original within the field? Is the essay scholarship of high quality and its argumentation rigorous? Does it make a new and significant contribution to its field? So, Renaissance art history or as a field. And then the next one, number 4, does it make a broader contribution to the history of art? And this is often one where people will say it's really good in its specific field, but I'm not sure why somebody in East Asian art would read it or why someone in medieval would read it. So that's something that for all Art Bulletin articles I'm looking for, is sort of what's its larger contribution? Is it well written? About the length? Should it be published as it stands? I never get a yes with that. Everyone always has opinions on things that could be improved, which is great. Would you suggest an additional reader? And should the essay be rejected? So those are the questions. And I think it's useful to know what I'm looking for. So when you send in an article, what kinds of things you might be able to manipulate. And again, this is for the Art Bulletin, which has a very specific agenda in terms of bringing new research in all fields into the journal. So, it could be if you're publishing in Grey Room, they may have a very different set of agendas that they're looking for. So it really helps to make sure that it's a good fit for the journal. So these are the questions that I ask readers to think about. Sometimes they literally just answer the questions. Sometimes they answer the questions and then send a whole list of things to be reviewed. I would really want to reiterate what several people have said, which is don't respond right away. Read the reviews, put it in a drawer for a day or 2. Do not send the editor a firmly worded response about what are these. That doesn't help. That's you can. There are essays that I've published or that get published where the critiques are really tough and they make the article better. So don't, it's not about you, it's about the work. So you got to kind of like calm yourself down because we care so much about what we're doing. It's not surprising we get upset about it. See it as a great opportunity to engage in a great dialogue. And I often say to authors, when they say this person had so many critiques, I'm like, that's great. If you got somebody to engage on so many different levels with your essay, you're doing something right. If they send me back one paragraph, that I worry about more than the people who send me back 10 pages of single spaced. I'm like, oh, there's lots that sort of got that person riled up. That's a good art. I mean, I want articles that get people engaged and see a kind of critique. So I think that these are all ways that you can think about the kind of writing process and the rewriting process, which is so important. I wonder if I could ask, sorry, Eugenia, we can probably get rid of the screen. I wanted to ask our panelists about their editing process and sort of how they go about, I mean, Maggie said a bit about she goes through, she highlights, but, sort of other ways to respond that you have found to respond to critiques. You can say, yes, this is a good idea. No, I'm not going to do that. But how do you actually kind of take the article apart or the essay apart and put it back together again? I don't know. Jennifer, do you want to?
Sure. I was just laughing because I usually do that first, kind of start that work at the gym, which seems strange, but just it's helpful for me to be kind of physically moving and in a state where I'm not at my desk to kind of go through, to print out. I like having the physical thing. So print out the reader's comments, print out the essay. To me, that gives me a little bit of distance. And then I think similar to what Maggie was describing, kind of start to just annotate where I see different places where I could start to address comments. And that makes it less, I think, as I love Maggie's puzzle description, I think it makes it less awful, this idea that like I'm annotating something that's already been written, as opposed to having to like see the Word document that I'm now, shuffling and messing up. So for me, that really helps. I mean, I think, yeah, I do appreciate the emotion of all of it, I think, because I think, as you're saying, we are so invested in it. And I do think that we're talking about distancing, and that definitely helps. But I do feel like sometimes the passion is necessary. And I think James was getting at that. Those comments that you really, I loved Maggie's excerpted ones, the ones that you're just like, this is just not true. Like, I just completely do not agree with this. And those comments can kind of rile your soul in a way that does make the final product better. But like, it requires you to sort of articulate what exactly it is about that comment that is just so not in keeping with what you wanted or what you're intending. And so I think for me, like these multiple, I don't know, I feel like Andy Warhol and like multiple mediation strategies of like ways to distance myself as author a little bit from that text, and to be able to see how I can insert and address. I don't know if others have.
Maggie, how do you go about actually, you've got not a first draft, but definitely not a finished thing. So
yeah, I actually like to cut first, because I find that that's actually the easiest for me to do. And of course, I always cut and then create a new document that says like, don't delete this, it's for later. And I have many of those that I've never returned to on my computer, of course. But it somehow, that for me is the easiest thing to do, is cutting. And then I deal with the reorganization stuff is the hardest for me, because it feels so you've spent so much time thinking through the logic of how a piece is going to progress, that when someone tells you, no, you need to introduce your methodology earlier, you're like, no, I had a whole plan for how we were going to get there. And I think that's the hardest, but I do take that seriously, because I think when a reader reads something, they're encountering it in a very different way from an author. And when someone says, no, I felt like, the first section was interesting, but didn't get to what you were saying. And, you really have to take that seriously. So I remember in my article, that was an issue, and I had to move some of the really crux of here's what I'm doing and how I approach the topic earlier on, even though originally felt like, oh, I don't want that there. It's going to be too boring or something like that. But you find ways to, when you move one thing, the hardest part, of course, is then to smooth it out again. But once you've moved it, you find ways. So it works out. It's just, that to me is the hardest. The cutting and the adding stuff is easier. You can always find some room for something else. But I think reimagining how an essay flows is probably the most challenging part of the editing process.
Maggie and to others, do you guys do reverse outlines? Do you know about reverse out?
I assign that to my students all the time, but I never actually done it for my own writing.
Oh.
It's one of my favorite in-class activities when I'm teaching. But I do think it makes sense for thinking through, is this logical, to the way that this progresses?
Right. Yeah. I find for my own stuff, not as editor, but I can never figure out the organization. I can never, because it's it could go here, it could go there. There's so many possibilities. And that doing the reverse, I never do an outline ahead of time, because then I feel like I'm following for me, that doesn't work. But doing the reverse outline and then using that as a separate document can often help. So, that's one way to play around with, and there's great stuff online. If you Google reverse outline, there's lots of good advice on how to do it. James, how do you deal? You've had a lot of stuff come out in a short period of time. How do you revise and rewrite? Do you have any techniques that work really well for you?
I'm a huge believer in huge bulletin boards. I have to get stuff off the computer for it to make sense and for order to start making sense. So I print out articles, usually single spaced, and put them up on these huge. So I feel like I can't wrap my head around an entire argument when it exists as a Word document. It makes more sense to me somehow when I can easily go and point to each section on a bulletin board. And then I use yellow legal paper and tear it up and literally cut and paste and tear the document apart, cut pieces in, rewrite sections on yellow legal paper. I do this with papers, presenting conference papers and things like this too. I sometimes have yellow legal paper mixed in because something made more sense the night before in the hotel room. I need it to be a physical thing, and I suppose it's my own way of outlining or handling structure is to literally get the whole thing up in front of me. It makes it easier for me to see redundancies or to see problems that other people are pointing out or that they haven't pointed out. But I think maybe it's a similar sort of it's similar in some way to what Jennifer was saying. The space has to change. I have to see things in a different, physically in a different way. So get yourself a cheap bulletin board from Lowe's is my recommendation.
That's I totally agree with that. I also have to print out all the Art Bulletin articles too, because I can't really just read them online. So I unfortunately killing lots of trees, but I have to print them out. And sometimes, just makes better sense. Eugenia, I think we have a question. We can.
We do. Someone asks, this is a good question. Someone asks, where's the line between a firm rejection with great notes and edits versus a revise and resubmit? What differentiates those?
That's I guess that's a me question. The I would say that the difference is really in scale, not in. It's not like, "Oh, this is just like terrible. No, no, no." I'm really looking at what's the level of revision that needs to happen. And most of the time when I'm asking people for revise and resubmit, and some authors get a little freaked out when I do this. It's usually a very fast turnaround. Like I'll say, I want this revised and resubmitted in a month, maybe 2 months. Partly because I don't want them to put it away and go back and work on the book and then come back. I sort of feel as though if they can do the revision within, like, it's, moving a few things around, adding in a better introduction, then for me, that I kind of keep it in the sequence, in the loop, because I'm like, okay, that'll come back, August 1st. If the things are correctly revised, or revised enough, then it can get put into production. So it's partly, for me, it's about, and again, this is from my journal. I can tell you other friends of mine. A friend of mine was just editor of the Journal of the Society for Architectural Historians. When you submit something and it's revised and resubmit there, they give you a year. I don't want to do that, because I want people to be able to turn it around faster, so that it's still on their mind. They get the critique, they're thinking about it, they can block off. Obviously, if they say, I just can't do, I can do it, it's going to take me 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but I need, I've got another big deadline due, totally fine. So, I would say if I were to be very honest, there are very few, maybe 15% of the articles that come in that could not be revised and resubmitted. Like, everything can be fixed, right? And that's the lovely thing. Everything can be rewritten. It's really, for me, about quick turnaround and scale. And if the critiques come back and there's some, and again, ideally more than one of the readers says this, if there's some real fundamental problem with the research, like, there's some really important set of documents that seem essential, I will probably reject it, because it's going to need a whole nother big iteration. I mean, a whole nother set of research that needs to go on. I will say, just so people know, sometimes I do send things back for revise and resubmit, and there are things that, as editor, I really think need to be done. The jargon needs to be taken out. And people are like, no, I must use this terminology all the way through. I'm like, it's not for the Art Bulletin then. And people get very upset and they say, but and I'm like, well, we're just at an impasse. So that has happened a couple times. I have to say, never with junior people, always with senior people. They don't want to change something. And I'm like, there are other journals. So that does happen, not very often. I usually expect people to come back to me and say, I don't want to change this. And I'm like, that's fine. Totally fine. Just tell me why you don't want to change it. And as others have already said, explain that to me in the text. Like, talk to that reader and say why, not literally like my second reader said this, but talk to that reader and say why you're doing it this way. And I often say, use the first person. First person is great. I know everyone was taught never to use first person. I love it when authors come back and use the first person and say, I'm taking this approach because blah, blah, blah. That's wonderful. So I hope that kind of answers, and the only thing I would question in your question is that the word firm rejection, like it may not be right now for the Art Bulletin, but that doesn't mean that in 6 months it won't be great for some other journal. You can't submit the same thing twice to the Art Bulletin. If it gets rejected, you can't just submit it again because of time constraints, but it's not a firm rejection. It's just not ready right now for whatever reason. Other questions, thinking about what I would be interested to know about how when all of you have sort of dealt with readers' reports, how do you even sort of frame that cover letter when you send back the cover letter, whether it's to an article or whether, James, you must have recently gotten readers' reports for your book. How did you kind of frame that cover letter back to the editor, the commissioning editor?
Yeah, it was 2 pages long or something. You don't need, I think, to be really verbose in this situation. I used it as an opportunity to try and ring my own bell and to remind everybody of a reader and an editor of what they seem to like already, and to try and restate the argument clearly and to try and reiterate my particular position, the approach I'm taking, why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then to honestly try and engage with what I thought were the most important pieces of criticism. You can't respond to everything, but you get some say in sorting through, responses by a reviewer to say it's what strikes me or what I've found especially useful in this person's responses are the questions they've raised about this, and this. And this is how I'm going to try and go about addressing that. Mm-hmm. And you don't necessarily need to have a fully fleshed out, in that kind of context, for a book, a fully fleshed out idea of exactly how you're going to do it. If you're responding about an article, it's presumably coming in with your response. And so you are explaining work that has already been done, a response that has been crafted. Right. But use it as an opportunity to restate your position, your argument, and how you have thoughtfully engaged with the very good, very thoughtful criticisms that you've been given. But I think there's a lot of work that sort of re-explanation maybe can do. Yeah. Use it as another way of sort of trying to frame simply your argument and explain why it is you're committed to a particular approach.
Maggie, how?
So I would say one thing that I always do is to point out that the ways in which your reader was able to understand and re-articulate your argument, because it confirms that there is a place for your work in the scholarship. So often in readers' reports, there are sections that are answering those very questions that Christy put up for you all about, what the prompts she sends to reviewers. And when readers actually answer them in the way exactly how you see it, sort of like, when you write an article and you say like, my contribution to my field is X, Y, and Z, and a reader actually says, well, this article contributes X, Y, and Z. I think that's the first thing you highlight is like, look, readers actually see what I'm trying to do and why it's important. And I actually think of the response as a way to brainstorm how to address certain issues. So, particularly for books, and when you have a delay and when you respond and when you actually have to do the revision, I think of that letter as a moment to start to think about some strategies for dealing with the critique.
Right.
So if there is a certain criticism about a section or an argument or a methodology or something, that's a space in which you're kind of like working it out in your mind. Like, here's one way I might address that, or here's another way I might address that. And you could actually say both. You know, I'm thinking about addressing this criticism in one of two ways. And I think it actually helps you think through how you will actually end up revising it to write it out. It's sort of like using it as a sounding board, as if you're chatting with an advisor or something like that. To use that document as a way to brainstorm.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I have started, which actually I wasn't doing when James submitted his article and revised it and then had it come out. But I've started for the Art Bulletin, and in talking to other editors of journals, people have started to pick this up, is after I send back the readers' reports, I really like to have a conversation with the author. I mean, often, most of the time, I don't know them. I've never met them. And I think they're nervous. They want the thing accepted. I want it accepted. I want them to do good revisions. And if we just have a half an hour Zoom call, which I set up with authors, it's really, we can just talk about all okay, this reader said they didn't like this. Like, let's brainstorm some ways you can fix that. I think one thing that is sometimes hard, I mean, it's still hard for me to remember, is the editor is on your side. The editor is not, the editor wants I need good articles. I need brilliant articles. So I want to help you get that article so good, it'll get you tenure like tomorrow. So use, the editor is somebody who's an advocate for you to help you make that article better. I'm not your advisor. I'm a kind of disinterested person who's older than you, who's done this a bunch of times. So, it's, I'm a kind of in a nice, what I want to say, detached space in which to help you. Because I'm not a friend, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you it's brilliant if these things need to be fixed. So I think really reaching out to the editors when you get those readers' reports back. And I mean, maybe not all editors can do this, but if you said, could we have a 15-minute phone call or Zoom call? They're really there to help you and support you and to make every issue of their journal the most brilliant thing. So that's what they're there to do. So really using them. And then the other thing, and we talked about this a bit last week in the last session, I am a great believer in using developmental editors. They are not free. They're an expert that you have to pay, but I think too often we think, we need to suffer in the salt mines by ourselves and not get help. And I think, if you have the finances, if your institution has support for that, there are great developmental editors who work with academic authors. More people than use developmental editors to help them really structure. They're not going to be experts in your field, but they're going to be experts in getting an academic book or an academic article to press. And so, I think that's another way to go as well. If you can do that, that's, but again, that can have an extra kind of cost to it. I'm trying to think, Jennifer, did we talk about sort of editing strategies? And so you do it in the gym, you're editing while you're on the treadmill, or, sometimes the other thing that I suggest to people is write a new abstract for your essay. Like, sometimes the abstract is written, make yourself write what your argument is very anew. take a blank sheet of paper and try to write it, write it down very clearly. So, very often essays will come to me that have been talks, they've been a CAA talk or somewhere else, and then somebody's kind of fleshed it out, but not always. Another great way of editing is to try to actually put it into a PowerPoint and give it as a talk, like even if you're just doing it at home, and see if that logic makes sense anymore. There's just all these kinds of strategies. I think there is a book, I don't know if the book references come by. I love this book by Susan Bell called The Artful Edit. I think it's really good. It gives me lots of ideas about editing my own stuff. I often suggest it to people. It's not necessarily written for academic authors, but just just for authors generally, mostly of nonfiction. But, I think the editing process is, most of what we do is rewriting. Most of the labor that we have. I always feel so happy when I get the first draft done. I'm like leaping around the house, but I know that most of the work hasn't been done yet, that really the work is in the editing and re-editing and rewriting. So I think, kind of getting that first draft done or even second draft done is just sort of a starting point along the way. Other questions. I did want to ask, I don't know, James, whether you've been asked to do this or not. I assume that Jennifer and Maggie have, to be peer reviewers. Any insights you want to share from the other side of the fence?
I have, but
have you?
Just a couple of times, and so I would defer to Jennifer and Maggie on that.
I'm happy to defer to either of you, but yeah, it does. It's like when you ask folks for recommendation letters and they write them wonderfully, and then once you are in a position to be able to write recommendation letters, you want to go back and be like, thank you so much for writing all those letters. And I think I feel the same way as somebody who now is lucky enough to get asked often to be a reader for things. And it just, it makes you appreciate so much those folks who were generative, those folks who were, ideal readers in that they read with you, but they were willing to sort of be like, this other thing would help, or this other thing would be amazing. So yeah, it makes me deeply appreciative for the amount of time that went into that with no thanks, right? Because usually you don't know who those folks are. And so it is an incredible act of kindness. I think for me, that question about the firm rejection versus the revise and resubmit was a really interesting one from the perspective of somebody who is writing a reader's report, because I think that is oftentimes a really tricky line as a reader to try to sort of navigate, the ideal versus, I think as we've already touched on, like what you would do if you were writing that essay, which is not necessarily helpful in any way, right? And so you kind of have that in your head in addition to like, well, how do I meet the author where they are? I think I oftentimes, as reader, feel like I get called on to occupy a certain disciplinary position because I'm oftentimes in interdisciplinary kind of situations. And so I think about that too, of the sort of allegiance that you have, not as gatekeeper, but as somebody who is kind of responsible for a subfield or a discipline, and in thinking about, how you really can do the best for that group of scholars. So anyway, I find it incredibly difficult. It's something that I do a lot. I wouldn't say I've gotten better at it, but I do it a lot. So I would love to hear any thoughts that Maggie and James have.
Yeah, Maggie, how do you?
Yeah, I've done this a lot, and for really like a wide variety of journals as well. So first thing I would say is that it takes me about a full day of work to do one peer review, because you have to read the article more than once, and you have to go through it and really deal with specific sections and answer all the questions that you're prompted to answer. And so really it's like a full day's work. I feel, that going back to that question about rejection versus revise and resubmit, the instances in which I have told an editor that an article should be rejected, there have been like several key reasons. One is that the article just is not well situated, researched. There's something really fundamentally lacking in a piece of research. That, for instance, there's a whole body of scholarship the author just like didn't talk about or read, and they've articulated an argument with total disregard for a whole conversation that's going on in the field or something. And the other case in which I've suggested rejection is for problems of fit. Like every journal has a mandate of like what their point of what they do is, whether it's for a certain subfield or for certain types of research or something. And there are cases in which an article is well written, but it just really doesn't fit the goals of that particular journal. It's like got submitted to the wrong journal, where it's like, in order to make it fit, it would have to be so revised that it wouldn't be the point of an already good article. They should just take it and put it in a different place. So those are the two kind of cases where I've been asked to review, and I've said that this, I've recommended a rejection rather than a revise and resubmit. I tend to think about writing reviews as a way to, I think as all reviewers do, to think of yourself as not just what you might say, but what your field might say. So, how would not just how I read this specifically, but I'm thinking about like how this would fit in a broader body of work, and not just how I might critique this certain argument, but how others in the field or others with certain methodological approach similar to mine might address it. So because I know that everyone, I tend to try to resist the urge to say like what I would do, like I would write this like this or something like that. It's really about improving what the author wants to do, or making what the author is trying to do more, successful. So I think that's how I approach the process, but I don't necessarily succeed always.
No, peer reviews are really hard to do. They're really hard to do. And to try to kind of find that right balance between making this article as good as it possibly can be. So, if you see something that has a red flag, you want to point that out, but also not saying if I were writing this article, because you're not writing this, you're trying to see it through the eyes of this person who sent it in. James, you were going to add in.
Yeah, I haven't done this very often, but a general sort of feeling I had when being asked to do it for the first time, but it's also applicable to the process of going through peer review too, is I have suddenly a different view of the field and much more respect for anybody who manages to write anything than I think I did as kind of an ABD graduate student, when you're many of us are in kind of a smart aleck mode, and you're quick to criticize articles that you see for perceived things that you would have done differently, or from your own little trench in a particular graduate department, you have your own little investments, and going through the process is not in a bad way at all, is a humbling experience. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for people who manage to do this again and again and produce good work. And I feel the same, I felt the same the first time I was asked to review articles, that this is, it's a laborious process. And when you see the process in action, not from the outside, but when you see how the sausage is made, it takes a lot of time and effort. And I think it's worth bearing in mind as you're setting out to try and write for the first time for a larger audience, to try and hang on to as much generosity for everybody else in the field and for the people who are doing peer reviews for you. Because having just transitioned from the place where you are a senior ABD grad student and you feel like you're kind of at the top of the pile, and then you suddenly become the low person on the totem pole when you defend your dissertation. It's a change of psychology, and I think it's made me incredibly humble about. I try to be more humble about my own work and much more respectful of the amazing work that everybody else is doing. So that's sort of a general thought on, yeah.
No, I mean, that's, yes. And I can tell you even more from my point of view, seeing how much work people put into their essays over and over again. I think we're going to have kind of a last call for questions. If there are anything that people have about writing, about editing, I have a few questions that, to sort of end it, but if anyone out there who's watching wants to put in questions, please feel free to add them into the chat. I wanted to ask, Art Bulletin is one of the harder journals, more complicated journals to get essays accepted into. How do you all decide where you're going to send things? How do you, you're working on something, especially if you have tenure, and pre-tenure is sort of one issue, but post-tenure, how do you write to the journal? Not write like send a letter, but are you saying, okay, I've got an idea, I think this would be great in a field specific journal, or I'm going to, at what point do you sort of make those determinations, knowing what the process is like?
That's such a good question. I actually think about who I want this to, who I'd like to read it, and what impact I want to have within a certain group of people. So I recently submitted an article to a journal in my field. Mm-hmm. And I decided to do that instead of the same art. I didn't write for that specific. I don't actually think I've ever written anything specific for a journal, like, geared toward it. But I was deciding between, like, should I submit this article to a major journal in my field or to one that's specific to the medium that I'm working on. It was about print. So, there are certain journals that are specific to print. And it could have, I think it could have worked in either, but I decided it was going to be a more interesting read for those in my field because it was about an artist who doesn't have a lot of visibility, but probably should in the field. Mm-hmm. And if it had gone to a journal that was more about print culture, I don't think that would have mattered. I think people would have read it for, what intervention it made about the history of print, and really the artist probably would have been known by people who already know about prints in that era. And so I think the decision was really like, I want to make some kind of intervention, whether it's like to introduce an artist to a field or to introduce a methodology to a certain type of subject or something. And I want to think about who am I talking to and who do I want to receive this intervention the most? And that's often how I make that decision.
Yeah, I mean that, because each journal has a little, subset of readers, and you're in the middle of the Venn diagram. So, which ring of people are you going to kind of reach out to? Jennifer, how do you have anything going on right now, an essay that you're trying to think about where to submit it?
No, I'm too busy doing peer reviews. No. No, that's cheeky. Yeah, I thought Maggie's response was just great. I mean, I do think one of the benefits of being a middle-aged tenured scholar is that, you know, I have a life list at this point of there's a finite number of articles left, and there's journals I've never gotten to publish in, and I would like to do so at some point. So I think I do have just kind of which I think I started in my graduate school days of just being like, where would I want to see my material be published? What journals had been super impactful for me? And so who would I, in a sense, kind of want to give back to in that way? I think also length of process is important. Like, you know, did you write something that if you send it to Art Bulletin, right, you're probably going to revise and resubmit, and you're going to spend a lot of time and energy. And I, you know, absolutely think that's worth it for somewhere like Art Bulletin, because you're going to have this significant impact across the discipline of art history, right? But there's other times when, you know, is this something that's really timely and something that open access could mean it gets read by the most number of people more quickly? And so that, I think, is also important to think about, of just like the amount of time it's going to take for the whole publication process to go through. Yeah, I think those are the big things I think about.
James, you've hit a lot of the big journals. You know, you've gotten things. Are there places, I mean, you don't have to reveal if you don't want to, but are there places that you're like, oh, you know, I'd really love to get my stuff there, you know, because it would have, you know, more European reader, or, you know, something, you know, more diverse reader, or a different audience to know about your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that was what I was going to address is, you know, so many of my colleagues are in Italy or Germany or Switzerland or France or the UK or Spain or what have you. So there's a different, you know, there's a different collection of possibilities there. And, you know, for even in my field, we're sometimes not as attentive enough to the fact that, while the Art Bulletin is read by everybody, you know, there are 3 or so German language journals who publish in other languages as well, that are of, you know, equal stature, and one in the UK, or several really, but and so, you know, there's a different sort of a calculus there. But when it came, I mean, I had sort of always assumed that I would try and write an Art Bulletin article related to my book, and this maybe addresses one of the questions that's just come in. And I'm planning on writing one article related to my book, a few other things, or work, you know, that will also in some form play a part in the book project as well. There are a few things from the cutting floor that'll end up being reworked for smaller side projects. But I think who's going to read it is important. And I mean, one of the journals that I have the most respect for is and principally because of the field I work in, is the Mitteilung des Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence, which is German, Italian, French, or English publications on mostly pre-modern Italy. And the quality of the work there is fantastic. It's an amazing, amazing journal. But it's outside of my field in the US. It's not a name that people who are reviewing fellowship applications or job applications are maybe going to be as familiar with. So if you're in a more junior position, like I am, and if you're in an even more junior position, as I was until very recently, some of these kind of strategic things, I think you do end up thinking about. I think the quality of work should always speak for itself. But you can, inevitably, you end up thinking about where are most people going to see this, and where are most people who are going to be sitting on the other end of the table when I'm interviewing for something. What is it going to mean to them? Even if, you know, some of the journals published by our colleagues in Europe and other places are amazingly good, they may not have the kind of reach into the US academia. But yeah, I just wrote a response to peer review last week for something else, in which I was thinking it was extremely helpful to be thinking about your prompts to us in the past couple of weeks, as I tried to square the circle between two completely different responses to something that I had submitted. So neither here nor there, but.
I mean, I think that this is, there is something that happens. I mean, I think it happens in graduate school, but not always. It's not, yes, we love our field, and yes, we love the work that we're doing. It's a job. It's like, it's like you go from being a student to being a professional. And, I guess that happens sometimes in some moment in graduate school, when you're starting to apply for jobs and fellowships and so on, and figuring out where you're going to publish things and what you get out first, what you get out second. There does need to be some strategy that you figure out, depending on, if you know what your 5-year goal is, then how are you getting from here to that goal in 5 years? Eugenia, do you want to, there was a question that came in.
Yeah, this is the question that James just referenced. Someone asks, how many, and possibly anticipates another webinar, how many articles on your specific subject is appropriate before the book project?
That's good. That's a good
What's the
question.
answer, Christy?
What?
What's the answer?
What's the answer? I don't know. I can tell you I did it wrong, if that's any. Yeah, I mean, I'll, in the interest of full disclosure, it took me forever to rewrite my dissertation into a book. And for all kinds of reasons, some personal, some intellectual, some, whatever, job related. And I published a lot of articles out of my book before, kind of related, but I published, I would say 5 or 6. And I know Jennifer's like, it was probably too many. In some ways I published them in this was a book on English architecture, which is a very narrow world. And I really wanted the stuff that I was working on libraries and reading practices of architects to get out to other people elsewhere. So, and I was just worried. I was worried, and I needed to, to be honest, I needed to do it for my own, to fix the dissertation and make it into a book. So it took me forever to do it. It was too many. I think a lot of publishers, I think I had a very generous publisher, but I think a lot of publishers would have nixed that and said there's just too much of the book that had come out earlier. So that's my, that's the bad example, the don't do what I'm doing example. And this time then I did other stuff, but this new project that I'm doing, I've published 1 and then the book's coming out. And that's it. So, that's probably too little, but, a friend of mine once said, and I think it's true for Art Bulletin, it almost, it does sort of take as much time to write one big article as it does to write a book. I hate to say it, it's almost the same amount of time. So I just needed to get on with the task at hand. But I don't know. What do you think about?
I think 1 to 2 maybe is what I've done in the past. So I have a book that's coming out in a few months, and I published an Art Bulletin article, which is basically kind of a mashup of the introduction and 1 chapter, which I think really works for Art Bulletin because it's a longer form, and you really do have to give a kind of broader argumentation beyond the specific case study for Art Bulletin, because it's trying to engage audiences that are beyond your, specific subfields. So I published that, and then I published another article that was kind of like half of a chapter, another chapter, basically.
And what, I mean, if the Art Bulletin was, where did you publish the other one?
The other one was like commissioned for us, like an anthology. Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing. We kind of haven't, we've talked about peer review as if peer review is the only game in town, but of course it's not. There are ways to get other things out faster, easier without peer review, which I think is something we could also talk about public humanities, getting things into public facing locations, other ways. But I want to let other, Jennifer, James, what do you think about how many?
Yeah, I always heard 2 to 3 chapters, but that's in that same range, I think. Yeah, but thinking back, just 2 sort of interesting things. One is I had always gotten advice of like publish as soon as you can as a dissertation student, and in some ways that wasn't helpful because it was sort of the first polished dissertation chapter, and then by the time the book review came out, that material, I mean, I think even one of my readers' reports for the book was like, well, have you seen, Jennifer Van Horn already did this like significant article about this, like what is there left to say in a sense? And you're sort of like, well, no, that's me, right? But it had been out at that point for like 5 to 7 years, so it didn't have the same kind of relevance in a sense. I mean, as soon as, I guess I wasn't thinking about the fact that as soon as you publish something, it's out there, right? And it becomes part of everybody's common knowledge in a way that it's very difficult to you then have to build upon that yourself as well, right? Because it's now out there already. I guess the other thing that I have been interested in too with the Art Bulletin is I've been lucky enough to publish with Art Bulletin and then to publish a book that had some of that same material. And inevitably people cite the Art Bulletin article as opposed to the book, which is understandable. It's been out there longer, but it is also an interesting sort of thing that I think thinking about the Art Bulletin article as in some ways this like in between a journal article and a book, it kind of occupies this really interesting position. So I hadn't really thought about that when I sent the material to Art Bulletin. I'm somebody who works between disciplines, and I was like, this is my most art history-y thing, and I want to publish an Art Bulletin, and this is probably like my shot. So I sent it to Art Bulletin and was lucky enough that it worked. But I hadn't been as strategic as I maybe could have been about what that would mean for the book manuscript versus that article. I do think, and I would just say that question about public open access publications and digital public history projects, and that just accelerates everything as well, right? So the second that you publish that dissertation research or that amazing source that only you know about is the second that everybody now knows about it.
Right.
And so if you were hoping that was going to be the big kind of scoop of an article or of a dissertation chapter, right, you've just given it away. So I do kind of, I think a lot about, especially emerging scholars, kind of balancing the desire to publish and to get material out there and to have your name associated with it, with the need to kind of make sure that you're not scooping your future self by putting that out there before you kind of are able to introduce it in the way that you see it working and the way you want to frame it.
That's really interesting. We'll let James go, and then I just want to add in a comment from the Art Bulletin desk. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still muddling through to the finish line with my first book. So I imagine in the long run it'll look like one Art Bulletin article, one fast shrift article, which is not really directly related to the book, and then probably something for a special issue, which is more methodological about the environmental humanities and art history, which is again it's taking a different angle on similar material. I mean, one thing I would sort of add, and I don't know, there's a sort of simple mathematical dimension to this, or arithmetical dimension to this, which is my sense is that books are getting shorter and articles are getting shorter. And I don't know if this is necessarily the case, but if an editor wants a book to be 80,000 words and not 120,000 words or something like that. I mean, there comes a moment, I suppose, in your trajectory when you stop thinking in terms of page numbers and you start thinking in terms of word count. At least it seems that way to me, once you start trying to publish things. And there's simple questions about that. You have less room if you're writing an 80,000 word book as opposed to a 120,000 word book, to pull material, perhaps. And Art Bulletin is still on the longer end for articles, but there are simple pressures like that as well. An Art Bulletin article is going to chew up more material than an article in some other very excellent journals. Even as Art Bulletin has, I think, gotten shorter from some of those huge whopping double column articles from 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, so Art Bulletin articles are, I'm going to say, I think we're the longest. We take, because we go up to 16,000 words and 20 images. So, most journal articles are going to be 8, 7, 8, I think is the, so we're almost double. I have often found that when I will get an article in, often from a younger scholar who's just sort of sending me a chunk of the dissertation or a rework chunk of the dissertation. One of the things I'm looking for in an Art Bulletin article is this: why is this important to the field? What are you saying, not just about your subfield, but about the whole discipline of art history? And to do that takes more than a paragraph to do. So, I'm going to often try to get people to compress, to give them enough room to have that breadth to be able to talk about why somebody in a totally different field wants to read this or should read this. So I do think sometimes, I hope that when I am asking authors to do that, it's helping them with their book, because it's kind of, I'm like, you're not framing this. You need to tell me, why does this matter to other people? And it's something that, they just haven't been asked to do yet. So I think that can be a really great stimulus to a better book, I hope, a kind of book that's larger. I also wanted to raise an issue which really came out not from an author, but from a peer reviewer. And I just thought it was such an interesting issue. So if I can do this without giving anything away. So I had a report from an author, from a reader of an essay. And the reader was quite concerned that material that they had presented at numerous talks had not been cited in the article, in the essay. And of course, I had no idea who would, whether the author was at those talks or not. But the peer reviewer was very upset that they felt, plagiarized, that they felt as though the work had been taken. And I think that's also something to think about, is I think a lot of people go to a lot of conferences, junior and senior, and present things. Now it's out there. It's kind of out there in the world. And in this case, I don't think there was any wrongdoing at all, but there are so many conferences, there's so many things online, workshops that you can go to. And I do think one has to be strategic. If you present it in a talk, it's out there, it could be online, it could be, and that's often a great way to get feedback as you're working on something, but one needs to think about that, especially if it is something that you're presenting a kind of new, a super new finding, a new document or something, sort of be thinking, okay, what stage, what part of this project is the talk? Like the talk comes out, I get feedback from the listeners, then I need to get the article out, or I need it to be in the book. But, conferences are fun to go to. And so people go to a lot of conferences and sort of present a lot of material. I wanted to, maybe kind of as one of the final things, talk a bit and sort of ask you all about your own experience with non-peer review writing and where you think about the non-peer reviewed stuff, the commissioned essays, the online writing, the Festschrifts, what else am I thinking of? The collected essays that may go through a kind of general peer review, but not the kind of intensity that, say, a journal article goes through, and how you are thinking about that work, how interested you are in kind of more public-facing humanities. So I don't know, have any of you published in those kinds of venues, or doing more than you might have done before? Jennifer, you're nodding. What do you?
No, absolutely. I'm sure we all have in different ways. A lot of exhibition catalogs, right, which sometimes are a form of peer review in a sense. And then I don't know. I think in my case, it just makes me really grateful for peer review, to be quite honest, because the trials and tribulations of peer review absolutely are there. But at the same time, you do have usually two individuals who are buying into what you're saying, who are who are reminding you of, like, you didn't read this, these four authors, and they're absolutely germane to your topic. And usually that's an oversight as a scholar because you just weren't aware, as opposed to any sort of deliberate attempt to not include someone's work. So I think those processes have made me really grateful for peer review as a kind of, both for the critical kind of observations that it yields and the fact that it makes arguments stronger, but also to have a kind of, extra two sets of eyes plus an editor's eyes that really help you to shape. It can also, the other bad thing about peer review is there's some gatekeeping that happens, right? And so I do appreciate the ability to sort of not have to worry about the ways that various folks are going to potentially respond to something, and to feel like, you might be speaking more accessibly or more broadly, or not having to make some of the really careful distinctions that you would if you were submitting for a really kind of strictly peer-reviewed journal. I think the other interesting thing that I would just wanted to point out too is, like, there's a lot of open access publications that will have some sections that are peer-reviewed and some sections that are not. So that's also really, I think, kind of tricky to navigate as a scholar, but just something to keep in mind, that particularly with emerging scholars, they don't always know to look for that, to ask that question at the beginning of, is all of this publication peer reviewed, is only part of it peer reviewed, and that has real implications for tenure files and for ways that committees are going to evaluate work. So yeah, I think it's like anything else. There's drawbacks, there's benefits, but it can be a really wonderful way to kind of free yourself a little bit of the kind of constraints of speaking to your academic peer audience.
Yeah. I mean, that, just to add in, I have had authors, and I hadn't thought about this before I became editor. I have had authors in a few instances where I've done sort of commissioned essays, like a special feature for the Art Bulletin, who, for various reasons of their own, I mean, I didn't need it to be peer reviewed because I was asking them to write a very particular thing, but they asked me to peer review it, to get it peer reviewed, because they needed it for a promotion file. And, that is possible, to ask if something is not, ask if the editor can send it out to two people, and, blind peer review. It is, it won't be possible in every instance, but if that's something that's really important for either professionally or the content, and you want it to be done, obviously you can give it to friends and colleagues, but if you want it done, kind of at arm's length, ask the editor if they can do it. Then you can legitimately say on a CV, that this piece was peer reviewed. So, it is possible. James, are you doing any kind of public humanities outreach kinds of things?
I'm starting to. I don't know if exhibition catalogs and festschrifts. I'm starting to write that kind of stuff, but I've never. That's not true. I did publish some exhibition catalog entries once, but I think it's hugely important to think about outward facing work. I also think it's important at an earlier stage in your career that your writing help you get to where you want to go. And so I think you need to be conscious about where you're sending certain kinds of pieces of writing. You don't necessarily want really huge, crucial chunks of a dissertation / book project to be placed in places where you're not going to get as much credit for it. I don't want to sound cynical, but I think it's really important. And you need peer review is gatekeeping. I mean, it's the way it's checking your work, and that's an important process to go through. And you're going to get, I know lots of people who are still extremely anxious about it. And you're going to get chewed up, but it's important for all of our development. And it's important to get you to the next stage of where you want to go, especially if you're on kind of an academic trajectory. So I would just be wary about and thoughtful about where you're sending things, because you need your main project, especially, to do work for you if you want to sort of pursue an academic path.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good advice, and and helpful in thinking about about how, like, who you are and how you identify within the field, and sort of who your audience is. I think is really important. But I am struck more and more. I mean, both within my own department and also as I serve on promotion committees, or we're asked to be a reader on a external reader on a promotion committee, how many more universities are rightly valuing public outreach, wherever that's possible. So I think, in a way, like, it used to be considered maybe something trivial or not very important in an academic career, and maybe this is just the Canadian perspective, but it's certainly super valued in Canada, and I think, schools that I've seen south of the border as well. So it's something to think about, and it's surprising, even those of us who don't even work on modern things, how often there is a possibility of saying something, having an insight, to write an op-ed about things that are happening because a deeper history. So I mean, there are all kinds of ways to think about being more public, whether or not, I mean, a new project that I'm trying to craft right now is not going to have, I can't believe I'm even saying this, is not going to have a monograph associated with it. It's going to be a series of 6 highly produced podcasts. And that's what I'm doing for it's a research project. And then that's what I'm doing because I want it to be very public facing. So I think, I'm tenured, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. But I mean, I think there are ways we can even re-envision our work, depending on what the project is. And, that also make it more fun too, like not writing another academic article. Maggie, have you done?
I have written, I've written my short pieces for more public venues. And what I've learned in doing that is it takes a lot more time to write a very short public facing piece. Like, it's like 700 words, and it took you like months to figure out how to pitch it, and then to revise the pitch, and then to actually write it. So I really admire journalists because they do this day in and day out. I want to do more of it, but honestly, the only time I've managed to do that is when I've been on leave. In part because as a historian, like it takes so much more time to just articulate what you want to say, because it's really for a different audience. You don't write an abstract in the way that you write an abstract for an article or for a conference paper or something like that. So it's a really time consuming process. And I hope to be able at some point to publish a book that's public facing, but it'll take me years to conceptualize. I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's but I hope that as we as the board and as CAA and the future editors of Art Bulletin, I mean, the landscape for the dissemination of our work as academics is really changing in kind of exciting and new ways. There will, I hope, always be a place for the Art Bulletin and similar kinds of journals, but I think that there's just a wider landscape than there used to be, and thinking about how we publish and where we publish, who we're talking to, literally if not figuratively, who's our audience, is all needs to be taken into account. And and I think, and I will speak of my own, is we can, those of us who teach at graduate institutions, we can all do better in helping graduate students negotiate some of that changing publishing landscape, even if they are fully within an academic job, or if they're doing something else with their PhD, that there's so many different other things that we can do that are beyond just the academic journal, as important as that is. So I think this is a good place to stop. A couple things. First, we would be absolutely grateful to hear from people who have been at the session, or who listen to it later. We're really hoping to do workshops again next summer, both the Art Bulletin and other of the CAA journals. So what would be helpful for people? What kinds of workshops would be useful? We're looking for ideas, and we will gratefully receive your comments. So I think the tag has been put up across the screen. So please let us know, or send me an email. What kinds of topics, what would be useful, and so on, and we will do that. And I want to thank the speakers, thank our roundtable, and I hope everybody has a great end to their summer. And if you're going back to school, as I am, if you're going back to teach, that you have a really good start to the fall semester. So thank you all very much. Thank you.